On a May evening in 1979, an 18-year-old woman went car shopping with her dad. Afterward, he dropped her off at her apartment, and the two went through their usual routine. She went inside first, did a quick safety walkthrough, and then came back outside to let her father know everything was okay and he was good to head home. It would be the last time he saw his daughter. The next morning, her roommate returned to the apartment to pick her up for work. Instead, she found her roommate missing and a disturbing scene left behind. Months would pass before a pair of men doing target practice made a discovery that ended any remaining hope that she might still be out there somewhere. In the decades since, the investigation has gone down a number of different paths, including false confessions and possible connections to other murders in the area. But when you strip all of that away and go back to the earliest days of the investigation, there are details that seem much more significant with the benefit of hindsight. And they leave you with one question. Did investigators have the answers in front of them from the very beginning? I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Debra O'Quinn. It was Monday, May 7th, 1979, and 18-year-old Debra O'Quinn spent the evening out running some errands with her father, 42-year-old Walter O'Quinn. Debra had been living at an apartment on Barnes Road in Jacksonville, Florida, with her roommate Karen, and she was without a vehicle, so she was relying on a lot of other people for rides. So that evening, Debra and Walter were out car shopping together. Walter took Debra home around 9 p.m. and told her to make sure she went inside, checked out her apartment, and gave him a wave-off. The complex that the apartment was in was a mid-sized two-story complex, and today the building has been renamed, the addresses have been renumbered, and from everything I can tell, it appears there is no longer a pool there that was mentioned in the early articles in Debra's case. That area of Barnes Road was about 6 miles southeast of the bustling downtown area of Jacksonville, and on the city's south side. By 1979, the area was already fairly built up, but nowhere near to the extent that it is today. Like many parents, Walter was protective of his beautiful, newly adult daughter, who was just out on her own starting her life, and so this was their routine. She would go in her apartment, turn the lights on, walk through all the rooms to make sure nobody had broken in, and then she would wave off her dad. That evening, it was especially important to do so because her roommate Karen was not going to be there at all that night. She was spending the night at the beach and coming home in the morning. I couldn't find out for sure if this was how they met, but it appeared that both Karen and Debra worked at the same company and they would carpool together. Debra was a secretary at the Fortune Insurance Company. So Debra did her walkthrough and then came outside. The last thing she would say to her father is, "Everything's okay, Dad." 10 hours later, just after 7 a.m., Karen would arrive home. When she called out to Debra, she got no answer, and as she walked through the apartment, she was struck by a startling scene. Throughout the apartment and in the doorway itself, there were bloodstains. Right away, Karen knew something was off, and she called Debra's parents, who then called the police. It was referred to as a missing persons case, but right away, Jacksonville PD assigned 2 homicide detectives. Detective Jerry Parker said that to label it a homicide investigation would be inaccurate. However, he said that right away they did notice signs of foul play because of the blood evidence and other evidence they didn't want to comment on at that time. He also said the apartment showed signs of disarray, but not necessarily a struggle, which was interesting. The 2-bedroom apartment did not show any signs of forced entry either. Evidence technicians on scene fingerprinted a door that led out to the pool, just a short distance from the apartment. In the meantime, police, family, and volunteers began searching the nearby wooded areas and waterways, looking for any signs of Debra, but they came up empty. Within a day, police communicated to local media outlets that they suspected that Debra O'Quinn had been the victim of a violent abduction, and they pleaded with anybody who had information to come forward. Debra's father and family members created flyers that they passed out all over Jacksonville. They were literally walking street by street. Law enforcement knocked on the doors of immediate neighbors and then everyone who lived in the apartment complex, and early reporting stated that none of the neighbors heard or saw anything unusual that night. But there is one crucial piece of information that I haven't shared with you yet. When Debra's roommate Karen arrived home to pick her up for work that Tuesday morning, Debra wasn't there, but the apartment wasn't empty. There, sleeping on the couch in the living room, was Karen's own brother, a man who I'll refer to as Jim. Karen's brother Jim was a 22-year-old custodian. When she asked him what he was doing there and what had happened, he said that he had arrived around 3 a.m. to the apartment after leaving his work shift at 2:30. He said he was driving home from work when he decided to pull into the apartment complex and he noticed Karen's light on, so he thought he'd stop in. He knocked and noticed that the door was unlocked, so he let himself in. Jim stated that right there in the doorway, he noticed blood and what he described as drag marks, but that nobody was home. He said he thought someone might have had an accident, and so he cleaned up some of the blood to help. When Karen saw the amount of blood and the various locations of it, she grew immediately concerned and called for help. Just as you probably are as the listener, police were puzzled by this chain of events. If we believe Jim's version of events, that would mean that something happened to Debra between 9 p.m. on Monday, May 7th and 3 a.m. on Tuesday, May 8th. But police were not about to just automatically believe Jim's version of events. They asked Jim if he was willing to be questioned, and he said yes, that he was. And they asked if he would take a lie detector test, which he also said he would. The results of the polygraph exam have never been publicly released, but they didn't hold him afterwards. Homicide Lieutenant Jim Suber told the Tampa Tribune that police were not entirely satisfied with Jim's explanation for being at the apartment. However, he would not elaborate any further. According to a May 11, 1979 article in the Florida Times-Union by Steve Garnis, one of the clues found behind in the apartment was a ripped and bloodied robe of Debra's found in the bathtub. Homicide detective Jerry Parker said that he was waiting on results from the state lab because the robe had what appeared to be slice or puncture marks all over it, but that they couldn't definitively tell what type of instrument caused them, if any. And with that in mind, back to Jim for a moment. Detective Parker was asked more about Jim's story and what they asked of him. According to Detective Parker, he reinforced that Jim got out of work, saw his sister's lights on, the same old story. But according to Detective Parker, Jim told detectives that he thought the blood throughout the apartment was menstrual blood and that he tried to clean it up just to help. Mind you, this was enough blood that it was on her bedsheets, her pillowcase, the floor, both bedrooms, the kitchen, walls, and by Jim's own words, there were drag marks in the entryway. So why would he think menstrual blood when he sees drag marks? How much does he think a woman is bleeding during her menstrual cycle each month? I'm being dead serious here, because if women were bleeding that much, we'd have a serious health concern. And listen, I pride myself with the men I keep in my life, and any man I've ever had that's close to me has never been weirded out when it came to going to the pad or tampon aisle or picking those up. And even they would probably not have the first thought be to clean up blood and just assume it was menstrual blood, even if that's what they thought it was from. And we're talking 1979 here, not to be stereotypical, but this was much more of a taboo topic. I don't think you'd find as many men back in 1979 just openly talking about menstrual cycles and being that comfortable. So it was just interesting. Nevertheless, Jim says he decided to put her robe that has the blood on it and the slice marks on it. He says he decides to put that into the tub alongside her sheets and her bedding and her pillowcase, and that he then decided he was going to wipe up some of the blood around the house. And, what are you even doing in her bedroom to notice that there's blood on her sheets and pillowcase? And there are just so many things I can't look past with his story. Where is your curiosity to see if she's okay? Why would you not find it odd that a light is on at the apartment and there is blood and drag marks, but neither woman you know who lives there is there? Aren't you worried about your own sister? Why would you keep hanging out there when she wasn't there? And then, according to Jim's statement, he just falls asleep on the couch at some point and is awakened to his sister coming to the door. Detective Parker asked Jim permission to search his vehicle, and based on reporting at the time, they didn't find much of value, but did find a hidden bag of marijuana. So they booked him on a possession charge, and when he was arrested for that, he was questioned additionally. He stuck to his story, took the polygraph test, which of course they didn't comment on, and he was released on cash bond. And when it came to law enforcement's explanation for Jim's odd behavior, they said, and I quote, "He's just awfully naive." For weeks and months, the search for Debra O'Quinn continued, and the Jacksonville community was gripped with fear that it would happen again. Detectives looked into anybody Debra was involved with romantically, and they found she did have a boyfriend, but it would have been impossible for him to have committed the crime. He was a sailor aboard the USS Sampson, and they actually had to write to him to notify him of what happened and ask questions of him that may have shed light on her social circle or anything he knew about her life. Based on conversations with family members, police did track down a lot of Debra's friends, family, and coworkers to talk to. They actually questioned 4 people who they deemed as potential suspects, but all were released. Debra was said to be a little more on the sheltered side, and as I said, this was her first time moving out of the family home. As often happens in these types of cases that seem to have no answers, the rumor mill started and police began chasing down what turned out to be a lot of dead ends. Part of it could have been fueled by the sizable reward put forth by Walter O'Quinn's labor union. Out of nowhere, of course, there was a psychic who came forward and said Lucifer, yes, the devil, was responsible for her murder and that only he could help find her body. He was later overheard at a bar telling fellow patrons that he was in charge of helping police. A 14-year-old neighborhood boy told his friends that he had abducted and killed Debra. When he was questioned by police, he said he made the whole thing up, and they said they were so convinced he was full of stories and nonsense, they didn't even put him on the polygraph. Weeks after her death, investigators were called out to a wooded area where it was described as pieces of flesh being discovered. However, they turned out to belong to a pig. For every outlandish lead, there were some that seemed more plausible. For example, just a week or 2 after her disappearance, a woman working in a toll booth contacted police about a disturbing thing she saw from a car passing through the toll booth stop. She saw a woman in the passenger seat of the car with her blonde hair parted down the middle and said she looked a lot like the photos that were out there of Debra. She said that the woman in the vehicle had her hands and feet bound and that she was screaming. So police began frantically driving up and down I-95 and Florida State Route A1A in search of this Toyota that the woman had reported. And amazingly, they were able to find and locate the vehicle and pull it over safely. But it was not Debra O'Quinn on the inside. It was apparently a domestic incident that had turned violent when a Jacksonville woman refused to go to New York with her husband. This man then tied her up and abducted her. I wish I could give you more information on it, but all I could find was this incident in relation to the search for Debra. So whoever that woman was, I hope she's safe and free of that marriage now. There was another lead that was connected to a stolen car from the morning of Debra's disappearance near her house. According to reporting in the Florida Times-Union, a Chevy was stolen on the morning of Debra's presumed abduction. The man who stole the vehicle drove it to a service station, and then he slept in it while he was waiting for the station to open. This was in the area of Interstate 10 and US 90. A service attendant opening the store called police because he thought it looked suspicious and thought he saw blood on the vehicle and on the man's clothing. Police caught up to the vehicle, and while they did arrest the man on grand theft auto charges, the substance was not blood, and so this was then not connected to the blood at the scene of Debra's apartment, which was the first connection that had been made. Authorities were contacted in June by Orange County investigators when remains were found in a wooded area, but the hair color and dental records did not match Debra's. It would take 218 days of searching, but on Monday, December 10th, that part of the investigation would come to an end. 2 men were target practicing in a deserted wooded area off Mount Pleasant Road on a totally different side of Jacksonville when they discovered a human skeleton and bone fragments amongst the leaves and scrub palmetto. The O'Quinn family was given the heads up that night, and Walter O'Quinn would later say that he couldn't sleep that whole night awaiting for the results. By Tuesday morning, dental records confirmed it. The remains found were that of Debra O'Quinn. Walter O'Quinn released a statement to the press and said, quote, "When you lose somebody like her, it's hard to explain the hurt. It's a special kind of hurt. Your heart actually aches." Dr. Peter Lipkovic, the Duval County medical examiner, determined that Debra died as a result of stab wounds. Later, the marks made from a sharp instrument on the bones were determined to be an exact match to the size and patterns of them found on her robe. This reinforced the theory that police had formed early on, that Debra had been awakened by either a knock or an intruder. She had quickly put on a robe to either answer the door or check out the noise, and then she was attacked. Because there was no signs of forced entry, and she was pretty safety conscious, police suspected she unlocked the door and opened it up for someone she knew. They also did not dismiss the possibility that the attacker was already inside when Debra got home around 9 p.m., and that he was just hiding when she did her walkthrough and waved off her father, though they felt that was less likely. A search of the area found the bones all scattered in a 50-foot radius. A large lock of hair was also found nearby, and I'm not sure if they determined that it belonged to her specifically or if it's unknown. The announcement of Debra being found brought forth a new lead released to the media, one that had been held back at first. According to reporting in the Florida Times-Union, and I'm going to read it directly as it's written, you can read it for yourselves when I link it in the show notes, but it said that between 1:15 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., May 8th, a neighbor was awakened by commotion and cries for help. The neighbor watched the dimly lighted parking lot through gusts of rain and saw a tall, dark figure dump something into a car trunk. At first, she thought the man was changing a tire, but the neighbor said 2 voices became 1 voice when the trunk was slammed shut. The woman said she did not realize the significance of what she saw until she woke up later that morning and saw a score of police cars in the parking lot. That's the end of the direct reporting from the paper, but it was also said that that night, that same neighbor, also said she saw what she thought was a man walking around Debra's apartment, but she couldn't make out any other details. It was more of just a shadowy figure. Now, this account does make me wonder if this is why police were looking away from Jim, the roommate's brother, because based on Jim's story, he is at work until 2:30 p.m. after this occurred. So that actually, this witness statement perfectly aligns with his version of events, which was that he does not arrive till 3, and by the time he gets there, she's already gone. Jim also didn't drive a car with a trunk, he drove a van. And I'm unsure how police were able to substantiate this, but police told the papers that Jim's van didn't move all night once it got there. I also would expect that they didn't find any noticeable blood in Jim's van when they searched it, which of course you would expect to see based on the scene at the house. So if this neighbor's timeline and what she witnessed was accurate, and it was related to Debra's abduction, then who is it? Another thing that substantiated this sighting was that a trail of blood led from the apartment to the parking lot. Information police hadn't previously released, so that's something that the witness statement matched up to. Now, on the hunt for her killer, it seemed like the case was finally heating up. Unfortunately, the case wouldn't go anywhere and would almost immediately grow cold. That was until the early 80s when a serial killer would claim responsibility. The next major break in Debra's case would come in the early 1980s with the arrest of a man whose name would soon become known to law enforcement agencies across the country, and whose name you may already be saying to yourself at this point: Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas was a convicted murderer who, after his arrest in Texas in 1983, began confessing to murders at an almost unbelievable rate. He claimed that for years he had traveled across the country, often alongside another convicted killer named Otis Toole, murdering people from state to state. And among the hundreds of crimes Lucas would eventually claim responsibility for was the murder of Debra O'Quinn. At first, investigators had reason to take his confession seriously. Lucas appeared to know details about Debra's murder that investigators believed only someone familiar with the crime would know. And there was something else that made his confession difficult to immediately dismiss. Henry Lee Lucas actually had been in Jacksonville when Debra was killed. Records later examined during an investigation into Lucas's confessions placed both Lucas and Otis Toole in Jacksonville in May of 1979. So unlike many of the murders Lucas would eventually claim responsibility for, investigators couldn't simply look at his movements and determine that this one was impossible. He was in the right city at the right time. For a while, it appeared that Debra's family and investigators might finally have an answer. But as law enforcement agencies across the country continued investigating Lucas, a very different picture began to emerge. Lucas had become an incredibly prolific confessor. After his 1983 arrest, he claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders, and investigators traveled across the country to interview him about their unsolved cases. In case after case, Lucas seemed capable of providing those special details that made his confessions sound convincing. Eventually, though, investigators began discovering that some of those murders couldn't possibly have been committed by him. Employment records, receipts, checks, and other documentation were used to reconstruct Lucas's movements. In some cases, he could be placed hundreds, even thousands of miles from the crime scene at the time a murder occurred. The man who had seemingly solved an extraordinary number of murders was admitting to crimes he could not have committed. Investigators began taking a much closer look at how Lucas was able to make some of those false confessions sound so believable. Lucas was very good at picking up information during interviews. He could use the way detectives worded their questions, watch their reactions, and adjust his answers accordingly. If an investigator indicated that something he said was wrong, Lucas could change his story. If their reaction suggested he was getting closer to the truth, he could build on it. There were also serious problems with the interview process itself. At times, Lucas was exposed to crime scene photographs, reports, or other information about the cases he was being questioned about. Details he learned during those interactions could later be reported back as though they were information he knew because he had committed the crime. And after being questioned again and again about murders across the country, it became increasingly difficult to determine which details had actually originated with Lucas and which ones he had picked up along the way. That realization forced investigators to go back and reconsider cases that Lucas had supposedly solved, and one of them was Debra's. Her case presented an especially difficult problem because investigators couldn't disprove Lucas's confession simply by establishing where he had been. As I said, he really was in Jacksonville when Debra was murdered. So instead, Jacksonville investigators had to focus on something much more important. What did Henry Lee Lucas actually know about what happened to Debra? And according to later reporting on her case, investigators interviewed Lucas and initially took his confession seriously, but as they continued questioning him, they began finding holes in his story. Despite appearing to know certain information about the murder, Lucas was not familiar with other pivotal details investigators believed the person responsible should have known. And of course, I don't even know what those specifically are because they, to this day, are keeping them close so that they can identify who may be false confessing or not. And so eventually, the confession fell apart. Jacksonville investigators determined that Henry Lee Lucas had not murdered Debra O'Quinn. But that false confession had consequences. Investigators had spent time and resources pursuing what, for a period, appeared to be a legitimate solution to Debra's murder. And when Lucas was finally eliminated, they weren't left with another suspect waiting in the wings. They just were at another dead end. Detectives across the country ended up putting together something called the Lucas Report, and it ended up showing how many ones they needed to now reconsider and not attribute to him, and it really was just a mess. So, after Henry Lee Lucas was removed from the equation, detectives were again left trying to answer the same question they had been asking since May of '79. Who killed Debra O'Quinn? It's a question that is still being asked today. There haven't been any major leads since the Lucas confession. Debra's mother, Carol, died just 6 years after her daughter at the age of 47. Her father, Walter, died in 1996 at the age of 59. In 2018, detectives worked with local news and the advocacy organization Project Cold Case to get more information out about Debra's cold case again. Debra's case long lived on the department's microfilm, capturing each step detectives took in those early days. In this 2018 piece, cold case detectives that were now working the case shared information that hadn't ever previously been shared. They had collected a palm print from the window on her bedroom window that didn't match anybody who had lived or visited the apartment in recent days. Though detectives say they don't know if the palm print occurred at the time of the murder or sometime before. Quite possibly the biggest piece of information they shared, though, was that way back when, the very first search of Jim's van, a knife was recovered. Not only that, its serrated edge tested positive for bone fragments. But there was not enough to prove it was human, let alone if it was Debra's. And so back to Jim we go, full circle. His story is that he's still at work at the time the neighbor describes the disruption, the pleas for help, the commotion in the apartment, and the shadowy figure and voices in the parking lot. Was that alibi confirmed, or did Jim work alone and we're having to go off of just his own words and timeline? Out of curiosity, what were his polygraph results? Did he know his sister would be away that night at the beach? Those questions barely scratch the surface of all the ones I have. And of course, I understand that with this case being an open case, most of those can't be answered to me. While I did not share Jim's real name, I did look into him and he's still out there. So if he is involved, he could still face justice. If he's not involved, we could finally be nearing him getting his name cleared once and for all. But I do wonder what possible testing could be done if that knife is still around, or any other potential forensic evidence from that time. In the 2018 piece, the cold case detectives reinvestigating the case said that they were hoping to use DNA advancements to get a break in the case based on the preserved evidence they have. So, share Debra's story, keep it out there, and let's hope that even as you're listening to this, the work is already in progress to see what can be done with the evidence. Project Cold Case is a great organization, and most cases submitted to their database are from family members. But Debra's case has a special badge on it. indicating that it was a law enforcement submission. That leads me to believe that the detectives really are working to do everything they can to get this case solved. And maybe soon you'll see it on the news as a case solved after almost 50 years. If you have information, that could help get this solved sooner. So if that's you, please contact the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office at 904-630-0500. To remain anonymous, you can call First Coast Crime Stoppers at 866-845-8477. I want to end the episode by sharing a bit more about Debra. She had been born on November 28, 1960, and lived in Jacksonville her whole life. She enjoyed tennis and picnics at the beach. She loved her younger sister, who was 6 years her junior. Her favorite color was Kelly green, and she often wore it as part of her wardrobe. She was a fun-loving student in high school who liked to make her parents proud. One teacher recalled how she had to be hospitalized for testing after a health scare, and that Debra went to visit her at the hospital and brought her 3 red roses to cheer her up. She was that student that the teachers loved too. Debra was an animal lover and adored her pet poodle named Baron. She was a hard worker who had just landed her first job, her first apartment. She was excited for her future, one that involved a fancy sports car that her and her dad had just picked out the night she was so brutally taken from her home. It's time for Debra's killer to be revealed and be taken off the streets for good. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review on your preferred listening platform and tell your friends about the podcast because word of mouth helps me tremendously. If you have a case suggestion, please reach out to me on Instagram or simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. I'm incorporating some bonus material, additional cases, and commentary on both Instagram and TikTok, so if you haven't followed me on there already, please go do so. If you wish to support the podcast monetarily, you can log on to Spreaker.com, follow my Spreaker Supporters Club. There's also a link at the bottom of the show notes. And when you do that, you get ad-free episodes while listening on the Spreaker app or logged in on the Spreaker website. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll have another case for you next Monday.